All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is the top of the hour, so we have a very packed agenda, so we're just going to jump right in. But thank you for joining us. I know there's a lot going on in this country, in our communities, so I appreciate people making the time, and welcome. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat, that's great. You can put your name in there, and if there's an organization affiliation, that's great too, but we're going to dive right in. So just some quick housekeeping. The chat is for comments and engaging in dialogue with your fellow attendees. If you do have a question, please click on the Q&A. If you don't see it at the bottom of your screen, you might have to click on more and you'll see a little Q&A box. That's where you should submit any questions. We are going to hold questions until the end. We will have time for discussion at the end, so feel free to add them as they come to your mind. And then if you do have closed caption on, you should have the option to turn that on or off. So go for that. So I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Lucy Milani. I am the Director of Policy for the Alliance for Emission-Based Recycling. I also serve as the VP of Policy and Communications with Eureka Recycling here in Minnesota. AMBER is a national coalition working to ensure recycling continues to be a public good and a core strategy for building a truly circular economy and a zero waste future. We are grounded in real world recycling operations. We focus on advocating for policies that keep natural resources in the ground, eliminate unnecessary and toxic packaging, and make recycling work as part of a system that prioritizes waste reduction and reuse. We push for accountable, transparent, and equitable systems that serve people, communities, and the planet as recycling was intended and should be intended to do. We know recycling is not the solution for all materials, but we need a strong and transparent and accountable system to get to a zero waste future. We are recyclers. We are boots on the ground every day, hauling, processing. We operate material recovery facilities around the country, and our view from the pile helps ground our policy work in reality, revealing how packaging laws and corporate design choices impact workers, communities, and the recycling system itself. And because we have this view from the pile and we see this constant flow and evolution of problematic and toxic packaging, we have been advocating for strong extended producer responsibility, or EPR, for packaging and paper laws across the country that would prioritize waste reduction, support scalable reuse, and support equitable and effective recycling programs that are good for people and the planet. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of EPR today. That's not what this is about. But there are seven states, that have enacted EPR laws for packaging, and those laws include some type of minimum recycled content requirement. We also have 5 states that have standalone post-consumer recycling, or PCR, laws. And today we're really going to dig into that piece of it. The work that's happening around minimum recycled content requirements in those EPR laws. And as with most policy, the devil is really in the details. So as recyclers, why do we care about how minimum recycled content is measured? Well, recycling only works when materials that people are sorting in their homes and recyclers are processing is actually turned back into new packaging and products. If manufacturers can claim recycled content without physically using recycled material, the system completely breaks down. And that's why accurate, transparent measurement of recycling content is essential for market integrity, system stability, and consumer products. And for these reasons, how recycled content is measured matters just as much as whether it's required. And so we are going to dive into how recycled content is measured, how industry is pushing for it to be accounted and measured in some of these laws, and what that discussion and fight really looked like and played out in Colorado as they are currently implementing their EPR law. So I'm going to introduce our amazing, wonderful speakers. We have Renee Sharp, who is with NRDC, and she's led NRDC's efforts to combat the health and environmental impacts of plastic pollution since 2024. Renee has more than 25 years of experience in environmental policy, research, and program implementation. We also have Rachel Setzke, who is with EcoCycle, one of our awesome Amber members. She's been there since 2019 and served as their senior policy advisor. Rachel has helped draft, advocate, and implement state laws, including the Plastic Pollution Reduction Act, the producer responsibility for packaging and batteries law in Colorado, and 2 composting bills. And then we have Brian Loma, who is the Hazardous Materials and Waste Diversion Advocate for GreenLatinos. Brian played a key role in bringing the Waste No More Denver ballot measure to voters in 2022. He owns Cut the Plastics EMC and is an active member of Recycle Colorado and Good Business Colorado, where he serves as a board member and on the hospitality team. He also serves as the environmental justice team for Colorado's EPR advisory board. I want to note that comments on today's panel from Brian represent his personal opinions and are not representative of his advocacy work on these various boards. Rachel and Brian are going to share about their experience in Colorado as it relates to this discussion. But before that, I'm going to pass it to Renee, who's going to give us an overview of this issue.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Lucy, and thanks everyone for joining today. I have 30 slides in 10 minutes, so apologies for talking fast. But I decided to talk to you today about deceptive accounting for recycled content. I'm Renee Sharp, as Lucy mentioned. I'm a scientist with NRDC. And so I asked this question to start off. If you saw this logo on a product package, would you think that it contained 30% recycled content, plastic? I mean, I would, right? It says it right there. But in reality, it actually might contain 0% recycled plastic. And that's through the magic of, there's actually a few ways that could happen, but the way that we're going to talk about that today is particularly around the magic of so-called mass balance accounting. So there's several different methods used to track actual recycled plastic, and claims about recycled plastic, which may or may not be valid, through manufacturing and supply chains. And mass balance is one of these methods. And while some forms of mass balance accounting are totally fine, other forms are highly deceptive. They allow companies to assign recycled content credits to virgin plastic and then sell it as, quote, recycled for higher profits. This means that plastic marketed as recycled may contain no actual recycled content at all. All right, so let's just back up for a second and talk about, what is mechanical recycling? It's pretty simple. You take plastic waste, you grind it down into plastic pellets, and then you melt them down and you mold them into new plastic. So-called chemical recycling is quite a bit different. That's when you take plastic waste and then you apply high heat, high pressure, chemicals, some combination thereof through a variety of different technologies, and you end up with either fuel or chemical components. Now, if you're making fuel, of course, that's going to get burned. That's not recycling because you're destroying the material. If you end up with chemical components, then further refining is needed to make them into chemicals that you could do something with. And then some of those chemicals could theoretically be made into plastic. So I have to pause because for some reason, sorry, there's like a giant light beam going into my eyes, which I was not expecting. So I apologize for 1 second because I can't actually see my slides. Okay. All right, so there's 2 major categories of chemical recycling. One is plastic incineration, and that comprises pyrolysis and gasification, which are 2 very old technologies that have been around for decades, and they are regulated as incinerators by the Federal Clean Air Act. And then you have chemical and solvent-based processes. These are not incineration, they have their own issues, and particularly solvolysis and solvent-based purification. Okay, so there's a bunch of different accounting methods for recycled content, and I'm going to go through each of them. So let's talk about the good accounting method. So Segregation and controlled blending. These are both accurate and transparent. So segregation, say you want to make 100% recycled plastic product. Well, you would take, 100% recycled resin that's actually recycled, and then you would make bottles or whatever that are made with 100% recycled content. Pretty simple. Okay, so say you want to make a 50% recycled content bottle. Well, in that case, you would take 50% actually recycled resin, 50% resin that was derived from virgin fossil sources. You blend them together, and then all of your bottles would be 50% recycled content. So in this case, the marketing claim corresponds to the physical quantity of recycled content in each product. Okay, so then, well, what if you want to account for feedstock fluctuation? But, say over 3 months, 6 months, you are using 50% recycled content, actual recycled content, and 50% virgin content. But over the course of, from a week or a day or a month, it might vary. But overall, you really are still using actually 50%. So to account for that, we have rolling average mass balance. So in this case, the marketing claim corresponds to the total physical quantity of recycled content, but not necessarily the quantity in each specific product. But if you melted all of those products down, you would end up with that amount. So it's accurate, but less transparent, but still good. Okay, so then let's get to the bad accounting methods, mass balance credit schemes. All right, so one thing you should know is that some form of mass balance credit scheme is needed for pyrolysis gasification to make some kind of recycled content claim. And some forms of these mass balance credit schemes can be used for other chemical recycling technologies, but they're not necessary. Okay, so, but we're really just mostly talking about pyrolysis here because that is the chemical recycling technology the industry is really pushing. So some things that you need to know, number one, it has very high energy requirements, like 800 degrees Fahrenheit, and typically very high pressure. The process generates toxic air contaminants and large quantities of hazardous waste. The output, if you take a bunch of plastic waste and you put it into a pyrolysis plant, the output is a mixture of liquids called pyrolysis oil. We're going to come back to that. Gases, which are typically burned to power the process because you have to get to those, 800 degrees Fahrenheit, and solids, char, which are typically landfilled. So those gases basically means that you're burning a significant amount of the broken down plastic to actually power the process. And really importantly, even when you get that pyrolysis oil, you can't just use it straight as you would like a virgin naphtha from fossil fuels. You actually have to dilute it by 80 to 98% with virgin fossil fuels to be able to be further process it into chemicals and fuels. So that's really, really important. And that all means that the plastic to plastic yield of pyrolysis, according to a DOE research study that was done a few years ago, you end up with extremely low yields of what you put in to begin with and what you come out with plastic to plastic. So you're not ending up with a lot of plastic. Okay, so there's a few different types of mass balance credit schemes, and we're going to talk about each of them. Proportional is the least bad, and then you have a few different kinds of non-proportional schemes as well. Okay, so let's talk about proportional credit allocation. So imagine, you take that pyrolysis oil, you have to dilute it a lot. So what you have going into a steam cracker is, say you have 10% pyrolysis oil and 90% virgin fossil fuel. Okay, and then let's just assume no losses to make the math easier. Doesn't actually really happen. Assume no losses and you have 100 tons of output. So in this hypothetical scenario, just imagine that you have 5 tons of high value polymer that you're eventually making, 5 tons of low value polymer that you're eventually making, 30 tons of petrochemicals, and 60 tons of fuels. Under proportional credit allocation, you can basically assign each of these products a 10% kind of recycled credit. And that's because how that kind of works is that we're putting in 10% pyrolysis oil, so it's all of these products are basically 10% recycled. So that's how proportional credit allocation works. It is semi-accurate, but not transparent. Okay. Then there's the next version, and that's called polymer only. So same scenario, 90% virgin fossil fuels, 10% pyrolysis oil. What you come out, you get the same outputs, except that this time, under this mass balance credit scheme, companies are allowed to just kind of like reassign of like, well, we made, 5 tons of low value polymer. We're just going to kind of assign those recycled credits to the high value polymer. Even though we didn't actually make more of it, we're just going to assign the recycled credits. So all of a sudden, that high value polymer can claim that it's like 20% recycled, even though, under proportional allocation, it's only considered 10% recycled, and you only actually put like 10% of pyrolysis oil into the steam cracker. So that's how that works. Also deceptive and not transparent. Okay, and so then you get to free allocation fuel exempt. So same scenario, 9% virgin fossil fuel, 10% pyrolysis oil, same outputs, except that this time you can reassign under this scheme. You can say like, well, we made a bunch of these petrochemicals. They're not going to actually be made into plastics. But we're just going to say that like they're kind of recycled. So we're going to assign the recycled credits to that high value polymer and just call it more recycled than, it really, even really could be claimed. So you can see how that's even more deceptive. Now, under this scheme, you can't actually reassign those fuels to anything else, but you can reassign the petrochemical recycling credits. Okay, and then you get to mass balance free allocation, and in this scheme, it doesn't really matter what you make. You make a whole bunch of fuels, well, that's not really recycling, but we're just going to call it recycling. We're going to assign those credits to the high value polymer, and like, bingo, somehow that high value polymer is now, you have 100% recycled, even though you only had 10% of inputs and you made a whole bunch of fuels. So you can see how that's like even more deceptive. Okay. Now, I do want to note that even these schemes that claim to be fuel exempt, they actually have an important loophole, which can still allow plastic to be converted to fuel and counted as recycled. And that's because the way that like these third-party certifiers certify this whole process work is that they only track the first sale of products. So if you are, say, like make a whole bunch of chemicals and you're like, okay, well, we're going to assign all those recycling credits to that high value polymer. And, we just sold those chemicals to a distributor. Well, we didn't sell it to anyone who's going to make fuel directly. So therefore, that's all good. And then those chemicals are no longer tracked, and who knows what happens to them. So that means that if you're transferring the recycled content credit to another material, the original material is no longer tracked in these systems and could be burned for fuel or used to make fuel later. So obviously a giant loophole. Okay, so why all this deceptive accounting? Well, basically, plastic marketed as recycled can be sold at higher prices. So basically, it's so companies can make more profit. So the problems with mass balance credit schemes are many. They're deceptive to consumers. They're not transparent. They promote plastic incineration. They disadvantage traditional mechanical recycling. Many forms of them are inconsistent with policy and legal definitions of recycling. And they also undermine consumer trust in the recycling system. So Rachel's going to talk about this a little bit more, but just to kind of, just so you kind of see it all in one place. What Colorado said is like, okay, here's all these accounting methods. We're going to say you can't use any non-proportional methods, and you can use proportional, but only fuel exempt. So that's what the Colorado determined, and they found the rest of them to not be compliant with Colorado law. And I do want to note, although we're not focused on this in this session, that there's another deceptive accounting method called book and claim that's also not allowed in Colorado. That can actually be used by like any recycler. That's also extremely deceptive to consumers. So that's for another day. And here's a couple of resources, a blog that honestly needs to be updated on mass balance, and some resources on chemical recycling. Thanks so much.
Lucy brings up my slides. I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Rachel Setzke. I'm with EcoCycle. EcoCycle is one of the founding members of Amber and one of the oldest nonprofit recyclers in the US. We run recycling and composting operations. We do extensive community education, and we work on with local governments and the state on zero waste policies. So, as Lucy mentioned, we need to create a producer responsibility system that isn't about managing waste, but is about keeping extracted natural resources in circulation for as long as possible. By making recycling easy and reliable, this new coordinated system can rebuild public trust and participation in recycling. But to get the system to work, we've got to do a few things. We must maximize the collection of materials that can then be sold into reliable, transparent markets, ideally within the US, to be turned into new products. We have to simplify packaging using recycled content in place of virgin natural resources. So in our current system, producers are constantly putting out new and varied packaging. They're assuming that recyclers are going to just repeatedly upgrade our equipment to find markets so that we can handle this packaging as it changes. And this variety of packaging is also really confusing to consumers because they have to keep guessing what types of packages can or can't be recycled. So by streamlining packaging, we're not only going to reduce consumer confusion and encourage them to participate, but we're also going to make it easier for recyclers to actually recycle material. A good example of this is that the squeeze tube industry, they've been doing a lot of work to redesign their toothpaste tube kind of packaging so that it's all made of all one recyclable resin. If they can do this, if they can succeed in their design and get all producers that are putting squeeze tubes onto the market to use that new redesigned packaging, then consumers can be less confused about whether they're recyclable, and recycling facilities can upgrade to be able to take care to process that material and know that their upgrades are going to be worth their time and investment. So we also need to ensure that we have backslide. Other way, there we go. That we have transparent and verifiable tracking for all packaging types, like what Renee was talking about. But by doing so, that's going to help us build trust in the packaging that's being recycled, to make sure that folks know that it is actually going into new products. And it's really important to note that right now, about 90% of materials that flow through material recovery facilities or MRFs, about 90% of those are paper, cardboard, glass, steel, aluminum. These are materials that have really strong recycling markets, and they have verifiable processes to track them into new products. Right now, about 10% of materials going through those MRFs are plastics that are actually recyclable, like bottles and tubs. And they can be recycled mechanically, and they can also be verifiably tracked. So all of this that we're talking about today, it's only a small amount of the overall packaging landscape that's not recyclable through these mechanical recycling processes, and that need those deceptive processes that Renee was talking about. And it's these plastics and their false claims that are really undermining people's faith in the whole recycling system. So after we've done those things, we can finally, these producer responsibility systems are going to provide universal recycling access. So we build the transparency and provide access. That's going to allow us to educate the public about the new transparent systems so that the public will hopefully then feel pride in participating in recycling. And they're going to be motivated to both buy packaging that's reliably labeled and that they'll then recycle it when it's done. Now, next slide. So Colorado's producer responsibility law, which was passed in 2022, both the development of that law and the work that's gone into beginning to implement it has really benefited immensely from the input of hundreds of interested groups and thousands of hours of research, focus groups, dialogues, negotiations. I'm boiling it down into 4 main phases, and I'll just give a really high-level view of how EcoCycle and our partners have engaged to build the best system possible for Colorado. So in the years leading up to the bill drafting and passage, advocates like us, we researched the best models that were out there. We debated sections of the proposed bill to craft what would deliver authentic recycling for our state. And the outcome is a law that we're pretty proud of. It's not perfect, but it really is a solid foundation to build on. The bill language has requirements in it that the needs assessment, which was the first step in our implementation process, include input from a variety of groups, including environmental NGOs and environmental justice groups. As a result of this requirement, the state's goals that they adopted out of the needs assessment for increasing recycling, they are aspirational, but they should be achievable using proven, authentic recycling processes. So the past year and a half since the goals were adopted, CAA, Circular Action Alliance, which is our producer responsibility organization, they've worked with our advisory board, the state agency, and many other interest holders to develop the implementation plan. As Renee mentioned, it was passed in December, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. So now we're finally in the implementation phase, which is really exciting. And I'm sure that the ENGOs, the environmental justice groups, the recycling advocates, and so many other groups, we're going to continue to engage in this process to make sure that our producer responsibility system lives up to the promise of delivering that transparent, trustworthy recycling to all Coloradans, and so that we can authentically recycle packaging into new materials. Next slide. So in our efforts to demand transparent tracking of post-consumer recycled content, the statutory definition of recycling has been really vital to holding the line against these processes that turn materials into fuel as counting as recycling. So I want to be really clear, the definition that's listed here in the middle of the slide, it doesn't preclude anyone from using those processes. It doesn't ban waste to energy. What it does say is that if you are taking materials and turning them into energy, you cannot count that material as meeting the recycling goals under our process. Also, free allocation, I also want to be clear that free allocation and credit schemes, they weren't really intentionally left out of our bill. It was just, we weren't really discussing them back in 2022 when we were putting together the bill language. What we were talking about was building a reliable system that would provide equitable access to all Coloradans for recycling, and to build a system that would increase our recycling rates and provide actual recycled content to producers to put into their packaging. So we'd certainly wanted to make sure that all of that plastic captured would turn into new plastic. That was the intent. And while we've been so successful so far in defending the need for transparent and verifiable system, we'd really recommend that other states coming after us be very explicit in your requirements for transparent marketing of recycled content so that you have the full scope of making sure that tracking is verifiable and transparent. Next slide, please. So a lot of text here. The bolded piece is the important part on the end. This is the actual language from the approved plan that Renee's slide was referring to. And so the implementation plan was approved in December. And like Renee said, it did not include free allocation or polymer-only credit schemes, which previous drafts had included. And while our coalition considers this a huge win, a major step forward in the right direction, in the description of how post-consumer recycled content will be tracked, the plan does allow for proportional credit methods, as Renee mentioned. It does require, or it allows for CAA to propose credit schemes in the future, but it requires that any credit scheme they propose can adequately ensure that allocation excludes use as fuels. So that's really important, again, drawing that line. And then any scheme that they propose, it'll have to be evaluated by the advisory board and then finally approved by CDPHE. So we'll need to continue this conversation in the future, likely in Colorado. But even with this language, which was a compromise between the state and CAA, the Producer Responsibility Organization, and included input from a lot of different groups, it's important to note that the American Chemistry Council has filed a lawsuit against the state based on this language. The last I'd heard, the suit has been filed, but there haven't been any further steps. Waiting to see what happens there. And I also want to note that, as happens with any groundbreaking law, there have been rumors about potential lawsuits since we were in the halls of the Capitol discussing the bill. This is groundbreaking, but allies and advocates, we will continue to work to implement this producer responsibility program that will benefit Colorado and all of our residents, producers, and recyclers. We'll keep on moving forward. Next slide, please. So as we move into the implementation phase, the work from groups like ours will likely be a lot more hands-on and on the ground doing the actual recycling and education. However, leading up to this point, our group's roles have really been centered around doing the advocacy, negotiation, and education of decision makers. So in addition to helping draft the bill language and testifying for the bill, EcoCycle and our partners have sent calls to action to our members. We've led trainings like this one, and we've engaged with state and the Producer Responsibility Organization directly. For example, in response to that original plan proposal, which included free allocation, our coalition members really focused some of our actions on educating the advisory board, where Brian sits, the Producer Responsibility Organization, and the state about these deceptive schemes. Groups like NRDC, EcoCycle, and GreenLatinos really took the lead in explaining the very wonky ins and outs of credit methods. While we shared articles, studies, and resources with the state and with our partners, and then we and our partners provided that message then out to our subscribers and to the public. And I just want to say, in response to that ENGO advocacy, that's why when we saw the state come out with their position that disallows free allocation in the producer responsibility program. And after that happened, we and our allies sent out a call to action to our members. We saw 900 of EcoCycle supporters alone, plus however many of our partners' supporters took action. And 20 organizations called on the governor to ask him to hold firm and support the agency's position on reallocation in the plan. This shows that even though the credit schemes are confusing, Coloradans are clear that they want a trustworthy recycling system that will reliably and transparently recycle packaging back into new products. I'm going to hand it over to my partner in this effort. Brian, take it away.
Brian, you're on mute.
Unmute. So hopefully that changes things. Hi, everybody. My name is Brian Loma. I am the Hazardous Materials and Waste Diversion Advocate for GreenLatinos. And the primary focus of what I've been asked to talk about today are the environmental justice impacts of tracking materials from capture to alternate reuse. However, before I do that, then we go to the next slide, I want to take just a quick minute using pictures to explain what free allocation mass balance looks like in a basic level so you can wrap your mind around it. So we start with used plastics. And in a chemical recycling sense, generally we're putting these plastics into a pressure cooker to melt the solid plastics into an oil sludge. Its technical term is called naphtha. We run that naphtha, and again, just the sludge idea in picture number 3, through a cracker, a refinery process, as you would see in picture 4. Now, when we bake a pie, a cake, or anything, we know there's a whole bunch of ingredients that are needed to combine to make that cake. In theory, taking the solid plastics and breaking them down is going to create a whole bunch of different ingredients that were used to make that plastic. As Renee said, assigning one of the ingredients, the recycled content product, does not make sure that we know what all the ingredients from the previous pie, that plastic, and how they're being used to make new materials. So hopefully that breaks it down just a little bit for you. to understand that we're taking this one item, we're cooking it, turning it in oil, breaking it into a whole bunch of new pieces, and then we just say, well, a portion of that, a piece of the pie is what we're going to give recycling credit to. And the rest of it, we're not going to track what happens to it. And in Colorado, as Rachel and Renee said, essentially plastics or fuel materials to fuel is not recycling. If we can go to the next slide. So, what is environmental justice? This is the main topic that I've been asked to speak about today. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. And this is, again, this is from the Environmental Protection Agency at the United States at the federal level. In the state of Colorado, we define through the Environmental Justice Act, which I apologize, I should have had the statutory number on this slide. But we do recognize environmental justice, that all people have the right to breathe clean air, drink clean water, participate freely in decisions that affect their environment, live free of dangerous levels of toxic pollution, experience equal protection of environmental policies, and share the benefits of a prosperous and vibrant pollution-free economy. And that's from the Environmental Justice Act. If we can go to the next slide, please. So, in the process of refining oil and chemical products, there are always toxic emissions. In the image that we see before us from a tour that I took in Death Alley, Louisiana, one of the multitude of facilities along the Gulf of the Mississippi River. We see dozens of stacks from a chemical facility, a refinery, a processing facility of some kind. All of those stacks are designed to emit materials, to have emissions into the air. And regardless of whether what materials you're making, refineries, smelters, all of them have, even a compost pile, you will see high levels of CO2 emissions over the compost pile, which is much better than the methane emissions coming out of the landfill. But can we go to the next slide? So the environmental justice impacts of technology agnostic accounting. I want to say those three words very carefully, because producer responsibility regulations in the states, EPR, are technology agnostic. That was something that was very clear during the state of Colorado advisory board meetings. So when we use accounting, we have to use accounting that works for each and every one of the methodologies that could be considered recycling or reprocessing the materials. And so when we have technology agnostic accounting, the ideas are that all the materials that have been used to produce a new product come from old products, which means the emissions from extraction are being reduced or eliminated. There's actually a potential reduction of fossil fuel extraction. For those of you who are familiar with the Permian Basin, many of the natural gases coming out of there are being used for single-use plastic production, as an example. So if we're able to take single-use plastics and make them multiple-use plastics through effective math and management of the materials used to make those plastics, then new materials do not need to be extracted to have a similar supply in the consumption cycle. Not only that, but the fracking, the byproducts of fracking, when we think about the methane emissions, when we think about things like produced water. And for those of you who don't know what produced water is, it's water that can never be consumed by humans or animals again, because the chemicals in it are used to produce the oils out of the ground, to extract. They're injected into the earth with things like PFAS included into the water to make the soils and the rocks break and release the oils and gases contained in them. So with the reduction of those materials, then also comes the reduction of the processing of those materials, which means that we have less toxic, harmful byproducts from facilities, refineries, in all parts of the world, but across the United States as well, right? NOx and VOx, particles that are 2.2 p.m. The CO2, the heat energy, all of these things that take away from the healthy environment, from the healthy atmosphere, from the healthy communities where people live. All of these factors happen in an environmental justice lens when the materials that we've manufactured are captured and reprocessed to the best of their abilities to be used as new materials, eliminating, in theory, the raw extraction processes. And as an example, I wanted to say that, in healthier communities where we have a production of less contaminants, we have things that are reduced. And in Colorado, we've named the first 5 priority air toxins: benzene, chromium, hexavalent compounds, ethylene oxide, formaldehyde, and hydrogen sulfide, which are the PTACs, the priority toxic air contaminants that the state of Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment are tasked with reducing human and environmental interaction with in our states. Next slide. Here we have a very bad photograph of a car flare of the refinery here in Colorado's most polluted county, the Suncor refinery in Commerce City. There's a flare in the center of the screen. That's the fuel destruction, hopefully, of harmful emissions coming out of the facility. This is the source of the air pollution for many of us. And this facility, if you've ever been near a refinery, it stinks horribly. So when we talk about the environmental justice implications of tracking all the materials that have already been placed into a manufactured good, we want to make sure that they're all tracked to new goods and that they're never just burned off and fueled off to justify further extraction. And when we assign a credit and then place it over here onto something else, it doesn't track the whole pie. And that's really, as we go to the next slide, where the focus that I had in the community and the involvements that we worked with in saying that this specific mathematical process used as accounting for primarily one of the materials in the recycling stream, but not all, that was an unfair and unequitable factor. And so what does this mean as far as the health impacts? We've talked about the emissions, the extraction at the fracking site, the emissions from the Death Alley and other chemical processing locations, the refineries. But there's also factors in the emissions of the packaging. You may or may not know that many shoe companies have learned to deplasticize the emissions coming off the shoes that impacted indoor air quality. But we haven't done that for the packaging that we use to store our food, to store the materials that we use in a daily basis. And so when we track everything in a circular process, we want to make it more and more usable. And so the theory is that there will be encouragement to detoxify the plastics, to make them easier for reuse purposes as well as recycling purposes. And that the collection systems in our consumption processes will grow, will be adaptable, will form new methodologies as the materials are healthier and safer to use over and over again, as we're tracking those processes. And so in theory, in an environmental justice lens, we will impose less toxicity upon ourselves as a people when we require the old physical extracted materials to be used new over and over again. And in all industries, when the old materials are used to make new products, there's a recipe. That recipe is known and it needs to be accountable so that we're not playing a bait and switch with what we did with this product or that product. And I think that, we're going to see cleaner air, cleaner water, better health for our bodies. And in the communities where we see high air pollution, air quality, water quality issues, we'll find less of that. So that's where I'll go at this point. I feel like I'm going long.
Thank you, Brian. Really appreciate everything from our guest speakers. I'm going to stop sharing now and we're going to move to some discussions. So if folks have any questions, feel free to add it to the Q&A. But Renee, maybe we'll start with you. So you've explained some kind of different methods for how recycled content accounting systems work, or could work in theory. What do you think the most, because it is a complex issue and it's going to continue to come up with EPR implementation. It's going to come up potentially at the federal level in some different spaces. What do you think is the most important thing, or the most for policymakers to be and advocates to be watching for, to ensure that recycled content claims are credible and transparent as new EPR laws are being proposed, and as we're thinking about implementation, given the complexity of it all?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it's really essential that we have very clear, accurate, transparent, and non-deceptive accounting methods, and that we do not allow the deceptive ones. From NRDC's view, we think that segregation, control, blending are fine. Rolling average mass balance is fine, and all of the mass balance credit schemes and the book and claim accounting schemes that I didn't really talk about that are related, those really just shouldn't be used at all. And if for whatever reason some state decides to allow some kind of mass balance credit scheme, then they should definitely follow the Colorado model and allow only fuel exempt proportional allocation, which is the least deceptive of all of them.
Great, thanks, Renee. And then Rachel, so I know that throughout the process over the last, from the beginning of the initial draft of the PROS stewardship plan, through today, there has been the influence. There's been influence from industry on your agency, on policymakers. What would you recommend other states do to either like combat that influence, or if there's anything differently you would kind of do going into that process. Because I know, like, even in your presentation, you talked about, I mean, there's things that we, as when we're drafting legislation, we can't anticipate will be things later on, you know? Yeah.
That's a good question. And I want to clarify first, the use of industry always makes me nervous because our bill absolutely had industry involved. It had the recycling industry involved. It had the production and consumer goods industry involved. Our coalition to pass this bill, it was absolutely a coalition of local governments, ENGOs. The Colorado Beverage Association was one of our major partners on this. So it was a group effort, and by having voices that represented different parts of the production, use, and recycling chain, we were able to make sure that we got lots of different views, that we tried to work out the unintended consequences. I mean, how many times in a bill this complex do you think you have it right, and then someone points out something really legitimate? It's like, oh, that's not what we meant. Let's fix that language. So I want to be really careful there and say that we have worked very much as a coalition, and Brian can attest to this, the number of public commenters sending in information to the advisory board, as well as speaking up at advisory boards. It continues to be an ongoing process of different groups weighing in. And I think that's really key. The more voices you have involved, the more people speaking up and saying, this is an issue and here's why, here's this, how this would play out in my community or for my business. Then when you have a few bad actors saying, oh, we're going to try and do this over here, you've got a lot more voices saying, here's what we want and what we need. Because sometimes there's a very clear right and wrong, and sometimes it's not a very clear right and wrong, and you have to find the best path. So the more voices you have participating in good faith, the better off you are. I see Brian's off mute, so I don't know if you want
to. If I can add to that, let's be really focused that the methodologies of accounting were not statutorily included. They were presented by an organization, the Circular Action Alliance, as the producer responsibility organization. And they were following recommendation and guidelines based on ISO standards. The ISO standards were not, and are not readily available to just open up in a book. You have to pay to see what they are. You have organizations, trade groups that are members of industry that are combining together to push these various methodologies on society, right? It's not the plastic gatherers, the companies that capture the recycled plastics from a MRF that are pushing for a free allocation accounting methodology. It's the processors of the plastics. And so as we fight to have a faith in the system, we have to have the transparency to see that what we're spending money to collect as plastic is being made into new plastic. And that's where this fight really came from and came into is that the tracking of that was not clear. And the way that it was explained was not clear. Even when the advisory board meetings had people from other places in the world, as far as a formal written decision on the acceptance of these free allocation methodologies, even the entirety of the EU has not made a finalized decision on whether they're acceptable or not. And so we're at a very raw starting place that required us to ask all of our partners to come to the table persistently to help draw attention to that item.
Thanks, Brian and Rachel. And I just take facilitated liberty. I mean, it seems that, one thing that EPR could potentially be doing is forcing producers to redesign their packaging And the truth, it's my understanding, the truth is that there's certain types of plastic that are just not going to meet the recyclability requirements. And so they're trying to find workarounds, and this is one of the workarounds. Renee, does that feel like that's maybe one of the reasons we're having this argument? Is there's certain types of plastic that are just that really should just be eliminated and redesigned to a different material, but there's such pushback that from producers that this is another sort of workaround on that.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like speaking about the mass balance credit schemes, not book and claim, this is really coming from the chemical recyclers, and specifically really from the folks who want to push pyrolysis gasification in the plastic incinerators. So that's really where this is coming from. That is, it's kind of a double whammy. I mean, to be honest, like, even if it wasn't coming from them, we would still be really concerned about this, because we really need to maintain consumer trust in the recycling system. And so there's like, it's kind of like two related issues. You have like consumer trust and deception, right? And we need to kind of promote consumer trust and like say no to deception. And then it just so happens that these deceptive accounting schemes are really for plastic incineration, which are super toxic, and not a good plan in terms of like, you know, they're basically a false solution for the plastics crisis. So what we want to see is we want, you know, accurate, transparent reporting, real recycled content. We want less plastic. We want more redesign. And you know, for those plastics that are difficult to recycle mechanically, you know, we want to transition to other materials or other plastics that are more recyclable mechanically, and to move away from all this consumer deception, which is not going to lead to anything good.
Yeah, I want to add to that because in Colorado, in February, March of last year, a company came in that wanted to chemically cook plastics. And when the farmland communities said, well, what plastics do you want even to start with? Let's talk there. They were targeting the number one easiest to recycle, PET, the number one plastic. And so it wasn't even like necessarily feigning to try to get the harder to recycle plastics processed. They were going after the easiest ones to mechanically recycle. And that facility did not get built.
So I know we have a lot of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. I want to ask what is next for Colorado. Just if Rachel and or Brian, if you have like a short little kind of what do you see coming up next, and how do you see this like continuing to play out?
Sure. As I mentioned, we are in implementation. So the Producer Responsibility Organization has been given the go-ahead to start rolling out the plan. They've asked for communities and processors to start registering with them to say, this is the role I play in recycling, and here's how I would like to be reimbursed for that, so that they can then negotiate contracts between the Producer Responsibility Organization and those communities and service providers. And by June, we should start seeing the actual program roll out, meaning some of the communities will be beginning to get that no cost recycling, and the pro will be starting to reimburse communities for education around the program. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, and I think that education key, like, it's great, right? By 2030, all small businesses, any place that a person lives that has trash service is going to get recycling. But what we're going to get to is that people will know that when an aluminum can is put in a recycling bin, it's back on a shelf in 30 days. When a piece of glass is recycled, that the glass is made into a new bottle in 45 days. I don't know if you can see my screen there, but the labels are changing so that when you go to get rid of your toilet paper or your paper towel rolls, that you know that the plastic goes back to the grocery store, the film bag, so that it can be made into a new bag or other materials. And it's really the next level of like we believe in recycling. We have faith that recycling is real, and we're doing it as a society because it matters.
Thanks, Brian. Your nice words. Okay, I know we're at time. I am going to share my screen. We did not get to all of the questions, but we will answer them and respond in our follow-up email to folks. I just some kind of key takeaways. I think as we think about guiding principles for EPR program design, a lot of this has come up, but these are some of the key things kind of to look for. Requiring physical traceability, which is something we as mechanical recyclers we have been doing. I thought I was sharing. Prohibiting mass balance credit and free allocation systems, banning credit trading for recycled content, explicitly excluding pyrolysis and gasification from recycling definitions, and requiring minimum yield requirements for responsible end markets and for MRFs, material recovery facilities. So thinking about yield as being really important is what the inputs you're putting in, there should be a yield, and that is something that some of the EPR laws have or are considering. So can be another safeguard against this type of accounting. So I want to thank Renee, Brian, and Rachel. Really appreciate your time and all of the work that you do on this issue. It's a discussion that we're going to continue to have, and it's going to continue to show up in different ways. So really appreciate all of the work, and I appreciate everyone attending today. So thank you.